You want to know the strangest thing I ever saw out there, past the last shipping lane, where human ships aren't even supposed to dock without a permit signed by 3 different governments? It wasn't a battle, it wasn't a weapon, it wasn't some fleet appearing out of nowhere. It was a princess, a real one, tall, silver-skinned, born to rule half a sector, and she stood up in front of her own mother, the queen, in a room full of soldiers who could have vaporized a man before he finished blinking. And she pointed at a human, just a tired, ordinary human with grease on his sleeves. And she said one word in their language, a word their kind almost never gives to an outsider. She called him family. And the whole room went silent, the kind of silence that has weight, the kind that presses on your ears. I was there, I saw it. Let me tell you how it happened because I still think about it. I think I'll think about it until I'm old. My name doesn't matter much, but for the story, call me Inez. I worked the human liaison desk on the Tideless court. That's the name of the place, a court that wasn't on a planet at all. It floated. A huge ringed structure spinning slow around a gas world the color of a bruise, all green and violet clouds turning under us forever. The Velthari built it. That was the species, the Velthari. Tall folk, taller than us, with long faces and skin like polished pewter, and eyes that didn't blink the way ours do. Beautiful in a way that made you a little afraid, honestly, like statues that decided to walk. They were old as a people, I mean. They had a court before humans had cities, and they ran everything by ceremony, everything, where you stood, how you spoke, which hand you used to pass a cup. There were rules under the rules under the rules. I spent a year there and I still got it wrong half the time. And into all that polished, careful, 1,000-year machinery, they put one human, just one at first. His name was Theo Marsh. He wasn't anybody important. That's the thing people get wrong when I tell this. They imagine some hero, some special man marked out from birth. No, he was a life support engineer. He fixed air. That was his whole job, basically. The court was a sealed ring spinning in a vacuum, and a place like that lives or dies on its air, its water, its heat. Someone has to crawl through the bones of it and keep the lungs working. That was Theo. He came on a maintenance contract, 6 years before the day I'm telling you about, because the Velthari, for all their age and grace, never much liked getting their hands dirty in the guts of a machine. They thought it was beneath them, so they hired out. And Theo just stayed 6 years, renewed and renewed, longest-running human contract on the station by a mile. I asked him once why he didn't go home. We were sitting in the human galley, the small, ugly one near the cargo locks, drinking something that wanted to be coffee and failed. He shrugged. He had this slow way of shrugging, like the answer was heavy. "Home's quiet," he said. "Up here, somebody always needs the air fixed." That was Theo. He needed to be needed. I didn't understand it then. I do now. Now here's where I have to tell you about the princess, because the whole thing turns on her, and you have to understand what she was before you understand what she did. Her name was Inez, Princess Inez of the Tideless line, heir to the Tide Mother. That's what they called the Queen, the Tide Mother, because their whole faith was built around the world below us, the turning clouds, the pull of it. The Tide Mother held the tide. The air would hold it after. It was that simple and that enormous. And Inez was lonely. God, she was lonely. You wouldn't think it to look at her. She had everything. Servants who'd die for her without a second of thought. Rooms the size of our whole human deck. Tutors, guards, 1,000 people whose entire lives orbited around her like she was the gas world and they were the clouds. But not one of them talked to her. Not really. They talked at her. They bowed. They recited. They watched their words like men watching their feet on ice. Because she was the air, and you didn't joke with the air, you didn't argue with the air, you didn't tell the air she had something stuck in her teeth, or that her plan was stupid, or that you'd had a rotten day too. She was surrounded by love, the careful kind, the kneeling kind, and she was starving. I think that's why she found him, or he found her. Nobody planned it. It started with a broken light, if you can believe it, something that small. There was a garden on the court, not a real garden, a grown one, in a sealed chamber with its own little sunstrip running the ceiling. The Velthari grew these pale blue flowering things there, sacred ones, that only opened in a certain light. And the light failed. One of the panels died, and the flowers were starting to close up and rot, and the gardeners were beside themselves, but none of them knew how to fix a panel, because fixing things was beneath them, remember. So they called the human, of course, call the human, he fixes things. And Theo came up with his bag of tools, expecting an empty chamber, and instead there was the princess sitting on the floor, in her court robes, holding one of the dying flowers in her hands like a hurt bird. He didn't know who she was. That's the part that gets me. He'd been on the station 6 years, and he'd never once been in the same room as the heir. They moved in different worlds. So he just saw a Velthari woman sitting on the ground, upset, holding a flower. And he said, I got this from him later, word for word, because I made him tell me 3 times, he said. Don't worry, I can bring the light back, give it 10 minutes. Just like that, like she was anybody. And she looked up at him, this scruffy human with a tool bag, talking to her like she was anybody. And she said later it was the first time in her whole life someone had told her not to worry. Think about that. The first time. She was 40 years old by their reckoning, an adult, the heir to a sector, and a maintenance man was the first person who ever just told her it would be okay. He fixed the light. The flowers opened back up, and he packed his bag and left, and only afterward, when she didn't have him sent away for speaking out of turn, did her attendants gently, terrifiedly explain to him exactly who he'd just been chatting to on the floor. He told me he didn't sleep that night, lay there sure he'd be expelled, maybe worse. But the next week, the light broke again. And the week after that. She kept breaking that light, Adif, on purpose, just to call the human back, because he was the one person on 10,000 who talked to her like she was real. That's how it began. A broken light, again and again, and a man kind enough not to ask why it kept breaking. I need to slow down and tell you what that court was like, so you feel it the way I felt it, because the strangeness of what those two did only lands if you understand how forbidden it was. The Velthari had a thing about kinship. Family to them wasn't loose like it is for us. We throw the word around, we call a coworker family, a team, a bar full of strangers on a good night. To them the word was sacred, and it was small. You were born into a kin line, and that was that, sealed, blood-bound. You couldn't choose family. The idea of choosing was almost obscene to them. Marriage even was a kind of contract between lines, arranged, formal, not a feeling. The feelings part they barely had words for. And there was a word, I'm going to butcher it, the sound of it, but it came out like Sayral, that meant your innermost kin, your truest people, the ones you'd open the airlock and step out for. It was the deepest word they had. You didn't say it. You almost never said it. To name someone your Sayral was to bind your fate to theirs in front of the tide itself, in front of their whole faith. It wasn't romance, and it wasn't blood exactly. It was bigger than both. It sat over both. It was the word for the people who were the meaning of your life. And it could not, under any law or custom or memory they had, be given to an outsider, not a foreigner. Definitely not a human, a species they'd known for less than a century, a young, loud animal people who'd shown up in patched-up ships acting like the galaxy was a thing you could just walk into. Hold how impossible it was, because she was going to say it, and I was going to watch her say it. But that's later. First the years had to pass, and they did quietly, the way the most important years always do. She stopped breaking the light eventually. She didn't need the excuse. She just started, finding him, a turn in a corridor, a walk past the cargo bay where he worked. She'd appear. Alone, which a princess is never supposed to be, having slipped her attendance, and she'd just talk to him while he worked. He kept working the whole time, mind you. He never stopped fixing things to bow and scrape. He'd be elbow-deep in a coolant line, and she'd be sitting on an overturned crate telling him about the council session that bored her half to death, and he'd say, "Uh-huh," and "Yeah, sounds rough," and hand her a wrench when he needed one held. She held his wrenches, a princess of the tie-glass line. She handed a human his tools, and she was happier doing it than she'd ever been on a throne dais in her life. He taught her things, useless human things, how coffee was supposed to taste before the machine ruined it, the names of old songs, how to whistle she couldn't, her mouth wasn't shaped for it, and she'd try and fail and they'd both laugh, and her laugh was a sound her own court had never heard, a real one, ugly and bright. And she taught him things, the names of the clouds below, how to read the tide charts, the old stories of her people, the long sad ones about the world before the world. Somewhere in there, and neither of them could have told you the day, these things never have a day, it stopped being a princess and her engineer. It became two people who were the best part of each other's week, then the best part of each other's life. I watched it happen from my little liaison desk, watched it the way you watch weather coming, and I got scared. Because I knew what they didn't seem to fully feel yet, that there was no room in the universe for it, not in hers. A human and the air, the court would never, the queen would never. There was no version of that story that ended soft. I almost said something. I almost pulled Theo aside and told him to be careful, to pull back, to remember where he was. I didn't. I've never decided if that was cowardice or kindness. Maybe both. Maybe they're the same thing more often than we admit. And then the accident happened, and after that there was no pulling back from anything. I'll tell you about the accident, because it's the hinge the whole story swings on. It's the reason she said what she said. It's the thing the queen, in the end, was really demanding an explanation for, even if the queen didn't know it yet. It was a Hull event. That's the dry term for it. The truth is uglier. A meteor swarmed small stuff, sand and gravel really, but at those speeds sand is a bullet clipped the court's outer ring on the sunward side. The shields took most of it. Most isn't all. A section breached, decompression. And the worst luck in the galaxy, the section that breached was the sacred garden. The one with the blue flowers. The one where it all started. And Inez was in it. Of course she was. She'd gone there to be alone, the way she did. Slipped her guards the way she did. And the wall opened to the black and the air started screaming out and she was on the wrong side of it. The emergency doors slammed shut automatically. That's what they're built to do. Seal the breach, save the rest of the ring. They sealed her in. Alone. In a dying room, with maybe 4 minutes of air and falling. The Velthari response was, and I say this carefully because I came to love some of them, the Velthari response was correct. Lawful, by the book. The protocol was clear. A single breached section, especially a small one, you do not reopen the seal. You do not risk the breach spreading and taking the whole ring, 10,000 lives for one. Even the air. Especially the air, because the air's first duty is the tide and the tide is the many, not the one. There was even a prayer for it. They had a prayer, can you believe it, for the loved one you let the seal keep, a prayer of release. They started saying it. They started saying the prayer for her while she was still alive on the other side of that door, still breathing, still pounding on it, because that was the law and the law was holy. And Theo Marsh, life support engineer, was 40 meters down the corridor when the alarm went. He didn't know the prayer. He didn't know the law. He knew the door because he'd serviced it 100 times. He knew its override. He knew that if you cracked the inner seal you could pull someone through into the airlock space in the gap before the pressure cascade hit. If you were fast, if you were lucky, if you were willing to be on the wrong side of the door yourself if it went wrong. The Velthari guards moved to stop him, because reopening the seal was forbidden, it was sacrilege, it would damn them all. 3 of them, soldiers, hands on him. And this is the part the whole court would argue about for a year afterward. He went through them. Theo, the quiet one, the one who fixed air, A man who'd never raised his voice in 6 years put an elbow into a soldier's throat and tore his arm out of another one's grip and got to that panel. Because down that corridor and through that wall, a woman who taught him to read the clouds had 4 minutes of air, and they were all standing here singing. He cracked the seal, the right way. The way only a man who knew the machine in his bones could. A controlled crack, a fast pull, a slam shut behind. He got her through. He got her out. He took the pressure spike across his own back doing it, and it threw him into the bulkhead hard enough that I heard later they thought at first he was dead. He wasn't. Broke 3 ribs, his collarbone, dislocated a shoulder, burst half the blood vessels in one eye so it stayed red for a month. But not dead. And the ring didn't lose its air. The breach didn't spread. The protocol had been wrong in this one case, this once. The human knew the machine better than the law did, and the law had been ready to let her die for a danger that a steadier hand could thread. But that's not what they remembered. The court didn't remember that the protocol was wrong. The court remembered that a human had laid hands on the Tide Mother's soldiers, that a human had broken the holiest seal, that a human had decided on his own that one life was worth the risk to 10,000. A thing no Velthari would ever decide, because their whole soul was built on the many over the one. To us, to humans, what he did was obvious. You don't let someone die behind a door you can open. You just don't. It's the most human thing there is, that stubborn, stupid, beautiful refusal to do the math when the math says let her go. To them it was almost incomprehensible, frightening. A glimpse into how an alien mind works, and the alien mind had run straight at a wall everyone else had bowed to. So you can see it already, can't you? The shape of the trouble. He saved the air, and in saving her he committed something close to a crime, and the only person in that whole court who saw it clean, who saw it for the act of love it was the woman he'd carried out through the dark. They put him in the human infirmary to mend, and Inez came. Of course she came, and the court could not stop her because she was the heir, and an heir can sit where she likes, but they wrote it down, all of it, the visits, the hours, the way she didn't leave. The court was always writing things down. He healed slow. She was there for most of it. I brought them food sometimes, our bad human food, and she ate it, this princess. She ate our terrible ration stew sitting on a stool by his bed, and she looked more at home than I'd ever seen her on the court. I heard them talk once. I didn't mean to. I was leaving a tray. She said, "You should not have done it. You broke the law. They wanted you to let me go." And he said, and his voice was rough still, from the ribs he said, "I know, I'd do it again." And she said, very quiet, "Why? I'm not your people. I'm not your kin. By every rule there is, I am nothing to you." And he was quiet a long time, and then he said the thing that started the whole reckoning. He said, "You're not nothing to me. You're about the closest thing to family I've got out here, maybe anywhere." He didn't know what the word meant to them. He said it the human way, loose, warm, half a joke, almost family, the way we'd say it about a friend. He had no idea he'd reached into their language and picked up the one stone you're not allowed to throw. But she heard it the Velthari way. She heard it land where Seiral lives, and something in her, something that had been starving since she was a child sitting alone in a room full of kneeling strangers, just decided. I saw it on her face from the door. I saw a person decide. She'd been given the word once, by a man who didn't even know he'd given it, and she wasn't going to spend the rest of her life pretending she hadn't received it. Now I have to tell you how the Queen found out, because the Queen finding out is where the floor falls away. It couldn't stay quiet. Nothing on that court stayed quiet. The visits, the words. The human who'd broken the seal, it climbed up through the layers of that careful machine until it reached the top, the way water finds its level, and at the top was the Tide Mother, Queen Saelath, Inez's mother. I only met the Queen a handful of times, and every time my mouth went dry. She wasn't cruel. I want to be clear about that, because the easy version of this story makes her a villain, and she wasn't. She was something harder to hate and harder to fight. She was right, by every rule she'd ever been given. She had held the tide for 200 years. She had buried a husband and a sister to the law of the many over the one, and she had said the release prayer over both of them dry-eyed because that was the strength her people needed from her. She had given up more to the law than anyone alive. And now her daughter, her heir, the one who'd hold the tide after her, was throwing herself at a human, at an outsider who'd profaned the seal. Was, the whispers said, ready to name him, to say the word. To the queen this wasn't a scandal. It was the end of the world. It was the tide line itself, the thing her whole faith hung on, being handed to an animal person from a young loud species who'd been in space for the blink of an eye. It was everything she'd sacrificed for mocked. So she did the only thing a sovereign does. She summoned them, both of them, to the Tide Hall, the great throne chamber, the most sacred public room they had, under the open dome where you could see the gas world turning below. She summoned the air and the human before the full court, before the council, before the soldiers in their silver, and she demanded in front of everyone, so there could be no quiet way out of it, an explanation. I got summoned too. Liaison protocol. The human had to have a human witness of record, so I was there. I stood at the side with my hands shaking, in that enormous bright hall with the bruise-colored planet turning under the glass floor, surrounded by 10,000 years of people who had never once chosen their own family, about to watch a girl choose hers out loud. They brought Theo in still half-wrapped in healing bandages, one eye still blood-red, walking stiff. He looked so small in there, so human, so out of place it made my chest hurt. He found my face in the crowd and he gave me this little tired nod, like, well, here we are. Iniz came in beside him. Not behind him, not ahead, beside, and the whole court saw it, the equal step, and a sound went through them like wind through grass. And up on the high seat, under the turning world, the Tide Mother looked down at her daughter, and the broken human standing level with her, and her face was a thing carved from the cold, and she lifted one long hand for silence she already had. And she said, in their tongue and then in ours, so the human and I would understand, so there'd be no mistaking it. You will explain this to me. You will explain to your mother, and to the tide, why my heir has let an outsider lay claim to the sacred word. You will explain it now before all of us, and if your reasons do not satisfy the tide. She didn't finish it. She didn't have to. Everyone in that hall knew the law. There were prayers of release for more than just doors. And Iniz stepped forward, one step, alone, in front of every soldier and counselor, and the mother who held her life in one hand. And I'm going to stop there, Adif, because that step is exactly the hinge into the climax, and I'm hitting the realistic limit of one response. Agar main ajthoda or thusangato quality gurjayagi, or opka no padding rule high, to main yahin clean cliffhanger p rock rahahun. She took the step, one step, and then she stood there in the middle of that enormous bright hall, alone, with her mother above her and 10,000 years of law breathing down on her, and for a second, just a second, I thought she'd lost her nerve. Her hands were shaking. I could see it from where I stood, a princess's hands shaking in front of the whole court. But she didn't step back. When she spoke, her voice was small at first, almost a girl's voice, and then it found something. You want an explanation, she said. I will give you one, but you may not like which language I give it in. A murmur ran the hall, because that was a strange thing to say, and the Velthari hated strange things said in the Tide Hall. You taught me the law of the many over the one, Iniz said, and now she was looking right up at her mother, right up the height of that high seat. You taught it to me before I could walk. The one bows to the many. The air bows most of all. I learned it. I believed it. I believe it still. She drew a breath. And by that law, when the wall opened and the air ran out and I was on the wrong side of the seal, by that law, I was already dead. You all agreed I was dead. You were saying the prayer. Nobody moved. Somewhere high up in the gallery, I heard one of the old counselors make a small, wounded sound. You were singing me to the tide, Iniz said, while I still had breath. And you were right to. That is the terrible thing, Mother. You were right. The law was right. Every one of you was right to let me go. She let that sit. She let it land on them. And then her voice changed, dropped, went hard and clear like a struck bell. And he was wrong. She turned. She looked at Theo, small, bandaged, his one red eye standing so still, and she said it again, to the whole court, pointing at him. This man was wrong. By your law, by every law you have ever given me, he should have stood in that corridor and let me die. That was the lawful thing, that was the holy thing, and he didn't do it. Her voice cracked, and she let it crack. She didn't fight it. He didn't even think about it. I asked him afterward, I asked him, did you weigh it, the one against the many, did you do the sum? And he looked at me like I'd asked him something insane. He said there was no sum. He said you don't leave a person behind a door you can open. That's all. That was his whole law. You don't leave a person behind a door you can open. I watched the Queen's face the whole time. It hadn't moved. It was still that carved, cold thing, but her eyes had moved. Her eyes were on her daughter, and they were doing something behind the cold. I have lived my whole life, Inez said, in a court of 10,000 people who would all, every one of them, correctly let me die. Who love me, I know you love me, who love me enough to sing me to the tide and do the right thing and never break the seal. That is your love, the careful kind, the kneeling kind, the kind that does the sum and gets the right answer and lets the one go. She turned back to her mother, and her voice went very gentle, which was somehow worse than if she'd shouted. And then a human came up to fix a light, and he didn't know the sum. He didn't know any of our laws, and he was the first person in my entire life who got the answer wrong. She was crying now, openly. In the Tide Hall under the turning world, the heir to the sector stood and wept in front of everyone and didn't hide it. So you want to know why I gave him the word, she said. You want to know why I let an outsider lay claim to Sayral? I'll tell you. I didn't give it to him. He gave it to me first. In the infirmary. He didn't even know what he was saying. He said it the human way, loose and small. He doesn't have a word for how much it means. He said I was the closest thing to family he had out here. He threw the most sacred word we own across a room like it was nothing, like it was easy, like it was just true. Her voice broke fully now, and she pushed through it. And Mother, no one has ever in 40 years said it to me at all. Silence, the whole hall. That heavy pressing silence again. And then she straightened. She wiped her face with the back of one silver hand, this completely human gesture she must have learned from him, and she said the final thing, slow, so there could be no taking it back. I name him, before the tide, before this court, before you. I name Theo Marsh my Sayral, my truest kin, and if the tide will not have it, if the law you raised me on will not have it, then say the prayer of release over me now, because I would rather be let go by the one who breaks the door than kept safe by the 10,000 who would never open it. And she stopped, and she stood there having said it. I have never heard a room that quiet. You could hear the structure itself, the deep slow groan of the ring turning. You could hear my own heart. I swear I could hear Theo breathing. Here is where it nearly went very wrong. I have to tell you this part exactly, because it's the part nobody believes when I tell it, and it's the truest part. There was a faction in that court. The keepers of the seal, they were called the most devout, the guardians of the old law, and they had soldiers, real ones. The kind I told you about, the silver kind who could vaporize a man between blinks. And to them, what Inez had just done wasn't love and it wasn't brave. It was the heir publicly profaning the holiest word they owned, nomming an outsider, a seal breaker, a human into the sacred kin, and worse, threatening to take her own release rather than recant. To them she had just announced that the tide line, the thing their entire faith hung on, was corrupted. That the next tide mother would carry a human in her innermost kin. And there was a law for that too. There is always a law. If the heir is judged unfit to hold the tide, if she is judged to have broken faith with the line, the soldiers of the seal may take her, remove her, quietly, for the good of the many. I saw them move. 3 of them, then more, easing forward from the edges of the hall, hands going to the long silver weapons on their backs, eyes on the princess and the human standing level beside her. The crowd felt it and pulled back, that ripple of a room realizing it might be about to see blood. And Theo Marsh, with his 3 broken ribs and his red eye and his arm half out of its socket, Theo stepped in front of her. He couldn't fight them, let's be honest. He could barely stand. One healthy soldier could have ended him without trying, and there were a dozen. He had no weapon. He had a body that was mostly held together with med gel and stubbornness. But he stepped in front of her anyway, between Eniz and the soldiers of the seal. And he put his hands up, not in surrender, not fists either, just open, flat, the way you calm an animal. And he said in their language, the little bit of it she taught him, broken and badly accented and absolutely clear. "You'll have to come through me." And he meant it. That was the thing. There wasn't a drop of bluff in him. He knew exactly what he was, a broken man who fixed air, who could not win this, who would be dead in a heartbeat if they decided it. And he stood in front of her anyway because she was behind a door, and you don't leave a person behind a door you can open. The lead soldier of the seal stopped, just for a moment, looked at this absurd small bleeding human standing in the path of a dozen weapons over a woman who, by their law, he had no claim to at all. And I think I've thought about this for years, and I think I'm right. I think that was the moment it actually turned. Not Inez's beautiful speech. This. A man who could not win, refusing to move, because the Velthari understood sacrifice. They worshipped it, the many over the one, giving yourself up for what mattered. That was their whole soul. And here was the alien, the young, loud animal person who didn't understand sacrifice at all, supposedly, and he was doing the most Velthari thing in the room. He was the one ready to be, the one who falls so another can hold the tide. Except he was doing it backwards. He was sacrificing the many himself, the law, the safe answer for the one, for her. And it short-circuited something in every devout soul watching, because it was wrong by their law and holy by their hearts at the very same instant, and they did not have a box to put it in. The soldier looked up at the high seat, at the Tide Mother, waiting for the word that would end it one way or the other. And the queen rose. 200 years she'd held that seat. She rose from it slow, and the whole hall went down, every Velthari in the place folding to the floor, the deep court bow, all of them down except the air and the human and the soldiers frozen mid-step in me, the foreign witness, who didn't know whether to kneel or not and just stood there shaking. The queen came down from the high seat, step by step, down the long dais to the floor, to them, and she stopped in front of Theo Marsh, this small bleeding human still standing in the way of her own soldiers, still in front of her daughter, and she looked at him for a long, long time. And she spoke, quietly, just to him, though the whole hall strained to hear. "My daughter says you do not know our word," the Tide Mother said, "that you said it without knowing what it weighs. Is that true?" Theo swallowed. "I didn't know," he said. "Not at first, I do now." "And knowing what it weighs," the queen said, "do you take it back?" And Theo Marsh, who fixed air, who could barely stand, who had nothing in the universe to gain and his life to lose, looked the Tide Mother of the Tideglass line in the eye and said, "No." The queen was quiet a moment. "Why not?" And he said it simple, the simplest thing, he said. "Because it's true, she is my family. I don't have a son that comes out any other way." I watched the cold go out of the queen's face. I did. I watched 200 years of carved stone law and buried husbands and dry-eyed release prayers. I watched it crack, just slightly, just at the eyes, the way ice cracks on a pond when the spring finally comes. Because she understood, I think, in that moment, the thing her daughter had been trying to say, that she had loved her own dead the careful way, the kneeling way, that she had done the sum on the husband she lost and the sister she lost and gotten the right answer every time and sung them all to the tide with dry eyes and a straight back, and that some animal part of her, some part the law had never quite killed, had always, Always wondered what it would have been like if just once, for just one of them, someone had refused the sum, had stood in front of the door, had gotten the answer wrong. She turned to the soldiers of the seal, and she lifted her hand, and she said one word, their word for stand down, and they stood down, slow, unwilling, but they did, because she was still the tide and the tide had spoken. Then she turned back to her daughter, and she said, and her voice was different now, not the carved stone voice, a tired voice, a mother's voice, she said, "You shame the law and is." A beat, the whole hall holding its breath. "And you honor something older than the law. And I am too old and I have given up too much to it, to pretend I cannot tell the difference any more." She looked between them, the air and the human, level, side by side. "The tide will have it," the tide mother said. "Tide help us all, the tide will have it." And that was it. That was the moment. The queen of the tide-glass line accepted a human into the sacred kin of her heir, in the tide hall, under the turning world, in front of a court that had never in 10,000 years chosen its own family, and now had watched a girl and a broken engineer do exactly that, out loud, with everything to lose. Here's how it ended. The small parts, because the small parts are what I actually remember when I can't sleep. They didn't get a fairy tale. I want to be honest with you because Theo would want me to be honest. He hated when people made it prettier than it was. The court never fully forgave it. The keepers of the seal never bowed to him, not once, not in all the years after. There were Velthari who'd leave a room when he entered it. Being named into the sacred kin didn't make him one of them. It made him a permanent strange thing, a question the court could never quite close. And it cost Inez, too. Some of the lines withdrew from her. Old alliances cooled. When she finally took the high seat years later, after the tide mother went to the tide for real, the natural way, an old woman in her bed with her daughter holding her hand, Inez ruled a court that was a little more fractured than the one she'd inherited. The human in her kin was a crack down the middle of her reign that never fully healed. She said it was worth it. She said it every time anyone asked, and a lot of people asked, usually unkindly. I asked Theo once, near the end of my own contract, whether he'd known what he was getting into. Whether, if he could go back to that infirmary bed, he'd say the word again, knowing the cost, the court, the soldiers, the cracked rein, the whole impossible weight of it. He thought about it longer than I expected. He always took the heavy question slow. Then he said, "You know what the strangest part is? They've got 1,000 years of rules about family. 1,000 whole books, and not one of them is about choosing it. They think family's something that happens to you. Blood line the tide like weather." He shook his head, that slow, heavy shrug of his. "Where I'm from, you choose. Half my real family back home isn't blood at all. That's the whole thing about us, I think. That's the human thing. We're the ones who walk into a room full of strangers and decide, you're mine now. And then we mean it so hard we'll stand in front of a dozen guns about it." He looked at me with that red eye, half-healed even years on. She'd never had anyone choose her. Not once. Everyone she ever met was assigned to her. Born into her line or sworn into her service. Nobody ever just looked at her and picked her. He smiled then, tired and crooked and human. "So I picked her. That's all I did, Inez. I just picked her. Out of the whole galaxy, I picked her and I told her so. Turns out that was a thing nobody in 10,000 years had ever thought to do. I think about that more than almost anything I saw out there, past the last shipping lane, in that floating court of careful, kneeling, beautiful people who loved each other the right way and let each other go. A princess called a tired engineer her family. The queen demanded to know why. And in the end, the answer was the simplest thing in the universe, the one thing all their books had missed, the one thing our scared, loud young species turned out to carry in our bones. You don't leave a person behind a door you can open, even if it isn't yours to open, even if it costs you everything. You open the door anyway, and you pick them, and you mean it. That's the whole story. That's all it ever was.